Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this latest event in our New York City Reborn series. I'm Michael Hendricks, Director of State and Local Policy here at the Manhattan Institute. So far in our virtual summit, we've talked about growth, we've talked about the mayoral race, policing and public safety, and today we're diving into housing, probably one of the most important issues that mayoral candidates are facing today and that all of us face more or less. New York, compared even with other high cost metros, just really stands out for the share of rent burdened households. And so as New York City tries to attract new jobs, new businesses, new people, the fear, the worry that a housing crisis and housing crunch will reemerge in this city, and in many respects, the crisis is still here, it never went away, really is a big one. So to tackle this topic and many more under the topic of housing, we have a terrific panel. As we discuss, please enter your questions throughout our discussion and I'll incorporate them in as we see fit. So joining me today for this discussion is first up Brad Hargraves. He's the founder and CEO of Common Living. Jessica Katz, the Executive Director of the Citizens Housing Planning Council. And last but certainly not least, our very own Eric Kober, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. All right, Brad, I want to start with you. You've been building Common and Kin, two novel housing solutions. Just let's start with the crisis, not only the pandemic, but where we've been in this housing crisis. What did you think when the pandemic first hit? What happened to your members? What did you see in housing over this past year?
So Common is known as being the largest co-living operator in the United States. When we started Common, we saw that there was a mismatch between the types of housing that was getting built and that was in the city's housing stock and what was really needed. Most notably, that there were millions of Americans who were living with roommates, often in apartments designed for families or for individuals, not for roommates. So obviously running a brand and a residential management company with a focus on roommates when a pandemic hit was, there was a lot going on. We had to focus on the safety and security of our members, the safety and security of our staff. What amenity spaces do we keep open? What shared spaces do we close? Not obvious when you're running a high density housing initiative as we were. That being said, the need for affordability was there prior to COVID, and it was still there after COVID. And we actually saw co-living occupancy trend higher than conventional multifamily for a number of reasons, but most notably because of the fact that we're cleaning these units every week. There is a set of services that make it easier to live with others, and most notably, they're 30 to 40% cheaper than a studio apartment in a similar building. The tenant composition changed over time. We saw more people opportunistically coming to the city because, what other time can you move to New York and rent a room in a high quality neighborhood in a high quality building at under $1,000 a month? We saw during the summer. So you saw a mix in who was coming to the city, who was taking advantage of what New York has to offer. But today our co-living occupancy in New York is back to 95%. So there has been a new wave of people come into the city. People are comfortable with it. It's a different set of people than we had back in January of last year. But I'm really bullish on what's to come for the city. And I think the future is the city's to make. So excited to chat about that more today now.
Yeah, Brad, one of the reasons why I wanted to start with you is that in some ways it feels like you and your residents are on the front lines of what's happening with housing in New York City. And so if you think about the people who maybe typically would live in a common apartment, maybe they're going to be a little younger, highly mobile in every sense of the word, but also potentially geographically. And so, one thing that I'm curious about is, as you're seeing people coming back, is it reflective of it? Are the places where they're choosing to live reflective of the kind of reshuffle across New York that we saw during the pandemic, if you saw it too? And by that, I mean, a lot of people seem to have left Manhattan. A lot of people seem to have left during the pandemic. Some of the very places that were in demand pre-pandemic, let's say Lower Manhattan, Do you see people coming back to Manhattan and a place like Lower Manhattan, or do you see them demanding more of Brooklyn, more of Queens, and places like that, maybe even farther afield?
Yeah, so we've certainly seen more strength in areas where you can get more space for a lower price. So a lot of emerging neighborhoods in Brooklyn, in Upper Manhattan, in parts of Queens, we've seen strength in the recovery. When people are coming back, right now it's very opportunistic. It's someone, our median age of our tenants is 29, which is a bit older than most people expect, but I feel the 22 to 25-year-olds are still living with mom and dad in many cases. That's a longer topic we can talk about at some point. But people in their late 20s and their early 30s, they're saying, hey, there's no better time to move to New York right now. I can do it. I can afford a place to live, making $35,000, $40,000 a year, which wasn't the case 2 years ago. Someone at that income level would really struggle to afford any kind of housing, let alone something in the neighborhood they wanted and the quality they wanted. So you have seen a lot of people, younger people who are more mobile, taking advantage of a time of relative affordability in the city right now. On the flip side, you have to understand the broader ecosystem, which is New York exists within a set of other metros which have not gotten necessarily more affordable. There are a lot of places where rents have gone up. Certainly home prices have gone way up. So New York is not just becoming more affordable on an absolute basis, it's also become more affordable on a relative basis by an even larger margin. So suddenly you're looking at a studio apartment in Raleigh, North Carolina, you're looking at a studio apartment in Bushwick, and the studio in Bushwick might be cheaper. And that's unique. Hasn't happened in a very long time, and ultimately makes me bullish on the city's recovery.
And I feel like, by the way, Eric Kober is going to have some good thoughts on that. This sounds eerily reminiscent of what Eric's been saying. But Jessica, I want to turn to you next. One thing that seems to have become not just a housing issue, but a public health issue is just the very notion of housing insecurity. That was something that has been brought up a lot, I feel like, during the past year with the pandemic. Housing insecurity, the challenges of overcrowding, even just having roommate households like Brad was talking about earlier. How did you see New York City responding to housing insecurity and overcrowding? What were some of the biggest, especially challenges that you've seen over the past year when it comes to housing?
Sure. So I was happy to hear, Brad, that folks are coming back and that are continuing to be in your co-living spaces, particularly because I think there was a real fear at the beginning of this pandemic, and CHPC did a bunch of research on this, that we were going to have a hard time recovering because the conventional wisdom would become that these like big, crowded, dirty cities are a public health risk. So that is not true. The data does not bear that out in any way, but it is sort of part of a long history of anti-urban sentiment in this country and kind of xenophobic sentiment in this country that cities are dangerous places. And the pandemic seemed to reinforce that in the public sphere. I'll just repeat these talking points because I continue to believe that this is a big problem for us in our economic recovery. New York City, even when we were the epicenter of the epicenter globally, residential population density is not the problem for COVID. There was major global cities that are much, much denser than New York City that had way worse experiences and that did way better than New York City did. The surrounding suburbs of New York City always had higher rates of COVID, even when we were in the worst of it. Rural areas in the rest of the country and suburban areas had much, much higher rates of COVID. So Trousdale, Tennessee has the highest rate of COVID in the United States last May when we were in the thick of the first wave, not New York City. So despite how hard we were hit, Our largeness, our size, our population density is in no way related to that problem. So I think that was a real big issue from a public health perspective, to make sure people understood, even if you live in a suburb, you can still get this virus. And it's going to be an even worse problem today for us in our economic recovery. So it's nice to hear that folks in their 20s are coming back. I want to make sure that everyone around the country, I don't want people to be scared to send their kid to NYU in the fall. I don't want people to worry when their college graduate wants to move to New York. So I think that's a perception of public health in New York. I think it's really, really important that we continue to beat that drum and beat back any misunderstandings about what that means. And then I guess my naive hope is that the interconnectedness that we all discovered creates a stronger city and a more equitable city for us. So it's not just, every man for themselves, my housing stability and my access to healthcare helps my family, but your access to housing and your access to healthcare is now going to make my family safer or more at risk. So hopefully that deeper understanding that New Yorkers felt who been through this whole year will create sort of a better consensus around affordable housing models going forward. And affordable housing development has always been both the social safety net, but also the economic engine. So in all past New York City disasters, and unfortunately we've lived through a few, those of us on this call, we really, the first thing that happens is the economic driver, when the general market at large is not quite ready to bet on New York City, we start to drive the economic engine of New York City by creating more affordable housing. And we also then lift up the safety net by doing the same thing. So it's a really important tool that the next mayor really needs to take seriously in order to drive our recovery.
And that's such a good point on urbanism and density not being the problem. The pandemic is the problem. And pandemics have struck cities before and they've bounced back stronger than ever. And certainly New York has been familiar with that throughout its history. And that there's also something not necessarily unique to pandemics striking cities alone. I mean, there's some, or not striking cities alone. They can affect people in all different kinds of environments. And New York City also has in many ways, many of the resources that can help respond to a pandemic, and that's a good note to carry forward. So, just one other one quick follow up is: did you feel, Jessica, that New York City had the right kind of variety of housing types that people needed during the pandemic, and that maybe New York City will need going forward, or are there missing, or are there gaps? One thing that I'm going to ask Eric about too is do we have enough missing middle housing? What was missing during the pandemic that we really needed to have had in terms of housing variety and options?
Sure. There's quite a bit missing. I think our failure to treat homelessness like an emergency really emerged as a problem. Again, we were sort of able to sweep it under the rug, unlike we have this right to shelter in New York, unlike some of the big West Coast cities with big homeless populations. So we were able to not see it quite as much. But that failure really drove some really serious issues that persist to this day. We virtually have no policy about overcrowding and kind of figuring out how to support overcrowded households and find a better solution, other than your solution to rent burden is overcrowding. So we really have not solved that problem. And then the third is we have known for a long time that our most essential workers have the longest commute times and have the most difficult time meeting ends meet. And that really started to hurt us, and we hopefully started to feel that. So one of the policies that CHBC had recommended was, instead of just going out your window and clapping and banging pots together at 7:00 every night, that we should prioritize essential workers in the affordable housing lottery, so we can make sure that everybody who was able to keep us safe when the rest of us were hunkered down in our tiny apartments here, that we really prioritize being able to keep them safe, keep them living in the neighborhoods that they need to be in, and that's going to keep everybody safer.
Eric, I want to turn to you. Kind of one broad question is, after this pandemic, looking back over the past year, but really looking back over the past 4 years, are we better off with housing today than a year ago or 4 years ago?
Well, 4 years ago, the city was prospering. The economy was expanding rapidly. And we had the problems of a city in which the economy is expanding rapidly, but housing is highly regulated and not able to expand with it. And Jessica just talked about rent burden. Rent burden is the households paying an excessive amount of their income on rent. And New York had more rent burden, and rent burden spread at higher rungs of the income spectrum, really going up into moderate to middle income ranges, something that was very unusual in the rest of the country, where rent burden tends to be concentrated among much lower income people. So we had people who wanted to form households, people who wanted to come to New York for work, and they were driving up the price of housing for everybody. And we weren't producing enough to make up for it. Today, we're in a recession. As some of my colleagues here have mentioned, the housing market has become significantly softer. And, for a time, rents are going to be more affordable to people who want to come into the city and move into the city. But I would expect that the next mayor is going to make it a high priority to get that economic engine revving again. And certainly New York continues to have many inherent advantages. It's the nation's largest city. It's got the largest labor market. It's where businesses want to be because they have the best selection of all kinds of talented people. And once the city's economy begins to revive, we're going to be back in a situation that we saw 4 years ago. And that will be good for tax revenue, which is very important for the mayor. But unless we make significant changes, we're going to be in trouble again, where we really need to remove some of the obstacles that we've inflicted upon ourselves that prevent housing from being created.
Yeah, so in one sense, you're sounding a kind of an optimistic note, like Brad was in a way, saying, the decline in rents, maybe in some well-to-do or very in-demand part of Manhattan, is someone else's opportunity to move there, maybe from another part of the city, maybe from another part of the country or the world. And that's part of what's driven New York's growth and opportunity over the generations. But on the other hand, it's that there's been years of, shall we say, disinvestment in housing, such that, even in the best case scenario, we do bounce back quickly and people do demand that housing, we may still not have that housing to meet that demand, because we haven't over many years, and maybe still haven't this year. So, hey, Eric, would you say that we're still in a housing crisis, and what does that even mean?
Well, we're certainly we're at a number of different housing crises. There is a housing crisis that affects the lowest income New Yorkers, and that is a crisis of affordability. And people who are vulnerable if anything adverse happens to them, like becoming ill or losing a job, they're vulnerable to becoming homeless. And that crisis continues, and it's exacerbated because hundreds of thousands of people have lost their jobs and fallen into poverty. There is another crisis that affects the city's ability to attract the kind of people it needs in order to for its economy to grow, to fill the essential positions, as Jessica was talking about, that exist in the economy, which we're far more aware of than I think many people were prior to the pandemic. And these different crises all require their own solutions, or simultaneously a series of different solutions targeted to different aspects of the problem.
Yeah. So speaking of that, Brad, I want to get back to you. So different solutions for the variety of housing challenges that we have. You've offered one in the form of Common. I'm going to get to Jessica next on kind of capital A affordable housing. But one thing that I find fascinating about what you do is that you're offering a differentiated housing type, and you can get more into detail. I'd love to hear more about what you do at Common. But you're offering a more, I guess, market-oriented alternative to something that is, what you're offering something that where there's demand for an alternative housing type, and saying, maybe it'll be a little less expensive than what you could otherwise choose to rent. What is that market demand for kind of, let's just say, naturally affordable housing, and what are the other opportunities that we can pursue to offer more of that kind of both market rate and affordable at the same time?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to build on what Eric said, which I thought was a really good point, that the housing crisis is not a monolithic problem. It's actually a lot of really small problems that are mutually compounding. And you could even add in, if you want to, a crisis of mental health and mental illness, which contributes to homelessness, which we see as a housing problem, but is in fact somewhat different. But to focus just on the solutions that we're working toward, I look at Seattle as a really interesting example, because people in New York, not to be too critical, but love to throw up their hands and say, we're New York, we're different, there's no lessons from other places that could be applicable here. But I just don't think that's true. And you can draw examples from the United States without even going so far as Tokyo, a massive city that has been able, through smart investments in transit and housing and a relatively liberal zoning code, to maintain affordability. But let's focus on the US. Let's look at Seattle. Prior to COVID, someone could very easily move to Seattle, a city going through immense growth, job growth from the technology industry, from the consumer products industry, and you could rent a studio apartment market rate for $900 a month in a great neighborhood in Capitol Hill, in First Hill. Like, Seattle had a great base of naturally occurring affordable housing. And I'm not talking about garden style apartments that were built in the 80s. I'm talking about new product, micro apartment product that was built just 5 or 10 years ago. And Seattle, because they've been aggressive, they're less aggressive than they used to be, but they're still very aggressive in enabling the market to build naturally occurring affordable housing, little a affordable, for a wide swath of workers. It doesn't solve all the problems. There are still going to be people who cannot be served, families, very low income individuals, that needs to be subsidized. You need a state solution there. And there's some federal programs that are flawed, but that's a much more solvable problem for a city, for a state to step in and say, hey, there's a segment, there's 10, 15, 20% of our population that cannot, at current construction cost, be served by market rate solutions. But I see a lot of cities, New York included, trying to address the entire spectrum of housing demand up into, upper middle class with some sort of, program, the 130% AMI band. It's absurd. You have a lot of buildings that were built with this 130% AMI band, so affordable to someone making 130% of area median income. Those are, you have to apply through New York Housing Connect, you have to go through the program, but it's above market rate in many cases, particularly now. So I think you're seeing some of the flaws of New York's approach, and I think there are examples, certainly internationally, but even in the United States, of cities that have been able to address a significant portion of the problem through the market.
Right, Jessica, I want to get your response, but it is interesting, Brad. You did make a very keen point that I think Eric, you made in a report recently, noting that some of what we call capital A affordable housing in New York is not necessarily what goes to those who are at very, very low incomes. There's still also a lot. So for anybody who's not familiar with that whole world, there is a band of affordable housing that goes to people who are making, what would be for anywhere else in the country, a pretty good salary, and offered at rents that are even sometimes at market rate, even higher, and yet still, of course, receiving New York state property tax abatements for being kind of capital A affordable housing. But Jessica, I wanted to get your response first on Brad's observation about that there is an opportunity to build naturally occurring affordable housing, or to even help cultivate that among the pre-existing housing stock in a state of housing abundance. But then, B, where's the gap in what we're providing in capital A affordable housing? Where is the need now, and what can New York do about it?
Sure. So this is a really important factor for the next mayor to take into consideration and really have an opportunity to reframe what the purpose of our housing policy is. So we've been sort of stuck in a cycle over the last several administrations where the housing plan of the city of New York is X number of capital A affordable housing units. And that's incredibly important. I'm very proud to have been part of that factory for many years. It's a really, really critical piece of the puzzle. But it's not a holistic housing policy. So what it doesn't do is answer questions around equity, around public health, around overcrowding. It sort of leaves those to the side and just says we're going to add more supply and hope for the best. And what it also doesn't do is talk through a bigger picture economic question around where are we in terms of housing production writ large, and not just through the tax credit program, through the federal home program, through city capital funding. So it doesn't talk about kind of overcoming some of the regulatory barriers to creating housing in the broader market. It doesn't talk about creating more access to something like a common, to co-living, to micro units, to ADUs, things like that. And then it doesn't also position us in terms of how our economic growth is creating this additional housing crunch. So there's this amazing piece of work from earlier this year from Citizens Budget Commission, where they sort of position New York City amongst the other cities. So we're right at the bottom of the list with Indianapolis, Baltimore, Detroit, Philadelphia, not cities that we tend to compare ourselves to in terms of our economic position. And then at the top of the list is where you see Austin, Charlotte, Seattle, these places that are kind of Denver, that are well known for having a high quality of life and big job growth. So those are the cities that have reacted to their popularity. And New York has just kind of hung back and let the housing crisis get worse and worse and worse. And we don't have a holistic housing policy that addresses that. And there's lots left behind. So particularly for public health, housing policy it was born in New York City as a public health intervention. We created these tenement laws in the early 20th century to make sure that everyone had access to a window, a toilet, a heating system. And we kind of forgot about that and have decided that housing policy, that, the medical experts will deal with public health, when fundamentally, and especially in a place like New York, housing policy is a public health driver. And we sort of need to get back to our roots on that.
Eric, I wonder what your take is on what Jessica said about there not being a kind of comprehensive housing strategy. I'm asking you because, when you were in the city, you authored a lot of reports around housing. Certainly, there's no shortage of reports and strategies on housing, but to her point on kind of a comprehensive answer, do you see it? Do you not see it? What's missing?
Well, what's missing is for New York to really, at this point, sort of retake its position as a leader in terms of innovation, urban innovation, and solutions to problems that cities have. New York was always considered a leader. But in recent years, other cities have really jumped out ahead of us. Other states have jumped out ahead of us and really started taking action on the kinds of antiquated restrictions that we still have on new housing. And a lot of those restrictions are in the zoning resolution, but many of them are not. New York zoning resolution dates back to 1961. It was a very pessimistic zoning resolution. The drafters at that time thought that all the growth was going to be in the suburbs, and any growth that took place in any part of the city would just result in another part of the city going into decline because there wasn't enough demand to go around. And so they drafted a very restrictive zoning resolution. Subsequently, and this is in significant part because of my efforts and my colleagues in city government, the city began to grow. It really began to grow in the 1980s, and it has grown almost continuously since then. And so at the low point in 1977, the city had 2.7 million private jobs, and that, by 2019 it had 4 million. And so a whole lot of people came into the city to take jobs, and we needed housing for them. And we were playing catch up, but we never really caught up in terms of unwinding the very restrictive set of regulations that were enacted in 1961. De Blasio, in his first term, enacted a very good and ambitious set of zoning reforms called Zoning for Quality and Affordability. That was in 2016. I worked on that with Jessica, who was at HPD at that time. And then he lost interest in further reforms. So we're going to go through from 2016 until he leaves office at the end of this year. And the zoning resolution has just gotten more and more out of date. And but we're not doing the kinds of reforms we need to do. So, what are they doing in other parts of the country? There's a concept called accessory dwelling units, which it's a second unit on lots that are already occupied by a single family home. And CHPC has done a lot of good work on this subject, and but we have not in New York City really made it possible. We still have a significant part of the city subjected to single family zoning, and it's hard to add another unit even where in theory the zoning allows you to because of parking requirements and other issues. I think, Michael, you mentioned missing middle housing, which is the idea of a small walk-up building. New York had at one time very permissive rules on building missing middle housing, which were enacted in the 1970s. They worked so well that we restricted them. We made them inapplicable in large parts of the city, and we haven't really replaced them with anything since. Another issue is parking requirements. For example, there's a building that I like to point out. It's on Queens Boulevard in Forest Hills. It sits right in front of a subway stair, and it has a CVS drugstore on the ground floor. I don't think anybody drives to that CVS. It's surrounded by dense residential neighborhoods, but that building had to provide about 60 parking spaces for that CVS.
Wait, Eric, how many?
60.
60. Yeah.
Yeah, it's one space per 300 square feet of retail floor areas. So it did it because as it happens in Forest Hills, parking is in demand, and it was the developer was willing to do that. But in most parts of the city, those kind of regulations just stop developers in their tracks. And when we passed zoning for quality and affordability, one of the reforms was to lift the parking requirements for affordable housing in large areas of the city, and that was great, long overdue. And I remember being interviewed at that time by a reporter for Streets Blog who asked me, "Well, are you going to follow up by removing the parking requirements, for market rate housing?" And I said, well, I don't really know the answer to that. We haven't had any discussions, but it hasn't been done. And it's the sort of thing that really needs to be done.
Mm. We have a lot of audience questions coming in. Please keep them coming. One quick follow-up to you, Eric, from an audience question is, what is the appeal of building quote unquote missing middle housing to those concerned? What is the appeal of missing middle housing to those concerned about New York's lowest income residents?
Well, New York's lowest income residents are going to need public assistance of some sort, certainly to afford new housing, but in many cases even to afford old housing, because the affordable rent, let's say at 30% of AMI, which is a income level, it's about $30,000 a year for a family of four. The affordable rent is just too low to pay for reasonable maintenance and operating costs. So the very lowest people are going to need some kind of assistance. There are government funded voucher programs for very low income people. One of the big issues is that vouchers are only available to a fraction of the population that needs them. But now when we talk about missing middle housing, we're talking about the next sort of level of income above the very poor, people who you might describe as moderate income. And when we built a lot of missing middle housing in the 1980s through zoning regulations, which for those who are zoning fans are called R4 and R5 infill. A lot of small immigrant builders got involved in building these with 2 and 3 family homes. A lot of immigrants got involved as developers in building housing for immigrants who were in fact in this moderate income category. And because they were walk-up buildings, they were relatively cheap to construct and the rents were relatively affordable. More so than in a new unsubsidized, say, elevator apartment building, a 6 or 7 story building. So it did fill a niche, and that niche was important. And the more of these niches that we fill, the better it will be for all of us.
Right. It's almost, and this is not a perfect description, but it's almost like releasing pressure on the housing market. You're releasing pressure on the housing stock that might otherwise have been available to those who are lower income, or to city subsidy dollars that might have otherwise been available. So Jessica and Brad, there are a couple questions here. Maybe you have some thoughts on this. I'll leave it to you to decide who wants to go first, but there's a couple of questions on regulations, taxes related to housing that seem to be coming down the pipeline or have already been imposed. So one person was asking about tenant protections and eviction processes, asking what would be a common sense improvement to them. But someone was also saying, look, we've got, a pied-à-terre tax. There's discussions on restricting the ability of co-ops to reject applicants. So all of this is kind of under the same rubric of tenant protections. What's good, what's bad, what should we keep, what should we do away with? Jessica, Brad, I wonder if you have any thoughts.
Well, let me just get back to the kind of missing middle and regulations point for just a second. I think these different subsectors of the housing industry are all interrelated to each other, right? So when you restrict Common's ability to do co-living, it means that 4 people who work at Google move into a 4-bedroom apartment that used to be occupied by a family with only one income earner. When you fail to do missing middle housing, then you also, it's not the housing is what's missing. It's not the people, right? So the people are still here and they're still coming. And
well
so then
said.
People start to move into other neighborhoods and put pressure on the very low income neighborhoods that we're trying to preserve. This is one of the reasons why I think we've built such a strong coalition around the Soho rezoning, which is a very unlikely group of housing folks who have come together around this, because everybody can see that when you preserve a core Manhattan neighborhood in amber, as we have done with Soho and NoHo, then people start looking elsewhere. They say, okay, I can't afford the $6,000 a month for Soho. Maybe I can move to the East Village. East Village is getting kind of pricey. Let me see what's going on in Fort Greene. Fort Greene's getting kind of pricey. Let's see what's going on in Bed-Stuy. So really all over the city, you can feel this ripple effect to making it illegal to do an ADU for a homeowner, making it impossible to do shared housing, and not creating housing at all levels of the market. So, that's criticized a lot when I talk about this as sort of trickle down economics, but it is true that the humans will trickle into these other neighborhoods if you fail to provide a housing option that's good for them.
Right, and talk just a little bit about that Soho rezoning, because that's become kind of a focal point for discussions on how can we adjust zoning regulations in order to accommodate the people who are demanding these kind of neighborhoods.
Sure. So I have been a very vocal critic of the de Blasio administration, but I really have to hand it to them here. They wrote a very, very smart report about segregation and racial equity in the housing market in New York City called Where We Live. And then at the end of Where We Live, it was a very smart analysis about the problems that even a progressive liberal city such as ourselves thinks of who we think we are and the ways in which we fail to live up to those values. At the end of the report, it says, and here's some of the stuff we're going to do about it, because the housing plan really didn't have a desegregation plan in place. And then there's also a regulatory aspect to it, where the two things that Soho is most known for, which is its very high level residential apartments and its retail spaces, both of those things are illegal under current zoning. So it's no surprise that there's no bodega in Soho, because you have to spend $500,000 on legal fees in order to make it through a special permit process. So in some ways, we're just sort of legalizing what's great about about that neighborhood to begin with, continuing to preserve the historic district, which is not touched under the rezoning, but there are some spaces around the margins that could absorb some of this housing need in one of these very transit-rich and job-rich neighborhoods that is really going to help kind of relieve the pressure in other places in the city.
Yeah, and you make a great point too, that so much of what we love about New York would be illegal to build today, and it's important to reflect on. Brad, there's a question that just came in for you, but it also touches on something that I just asked. So, what are some of the biggest regulatory and legal hurdles that you face at Common, and is there anything kind of coming down the pike or occurred during the pandemic that especially worried you?
Yeah, so the biggest one is the same as it's been since the beginning, and is pretty much the same across all major cities in the U.S., which is to make sure that we don't accidentally become an SRO. An SRO stands for single room occupancy dwelling. There used to be a lot of these back in the early 20th century. There were really nice SROs that looked like high quality hotels. There were also SROs that served as a housing of last resort for the poorest and the poor. Today, there's still about, I think Jessica would probably know this better than I would, around 40,000 units of SROs in New York City. And they have the unique distinction of being both protected and illegal, meaning you can't build new ones, but you can't really do anything with the ones that exist today. Obviously, the SRO model is not exactly what we're going for at Common. We're creating communities, we're creating really fostering, roommate shares where living together is part of it. But there are certain things we cannot do in most markets. For instance, we can't have exterior key locks on bedroom doors. That is, most inspectors will, say that that's an SRO. People have to be together on a lease in a co-living unit. And approaching it from the other angle, we also can't build, if we were building more studios or micro units, we can't build to the level of density that's going to generate real affordability for a number of reasons. And it's not like just one law that would prevent us from building a building that is entirely small studios, which is really what the market wants. It's what the market wanted prior to COVID. It's what the market still wants today. There are a lot of regulatory reasons, from parking requirements in outer boroughs to various density regulations that would prevent us from doing that aren't really tied into any life and health safety prerogative, but are simply the way the rules are set up. So these are things we work around in the markets we're in, but obviously in markets where those rules are a bit more liberal, places like Seattle, you can see it in the price. We're able to offer higher quality product for a much, much lower price. And those
right. And Brad, you would, if you could, you would
absolutely
offer even more affordable housing options if you could, if not for the regulations in place.
Absolutely. If, and I'm not talking about, fire code, I'm not talking about anything safety related, but, the density regulations, the parking code, or the parking requirements are why, we can't have a studio for $900 a month in a great neighborhood in North Brooklyn or Western Queens. It's just purely a policy choice. There's no other reason for it.
Eric, there's a question that just came in on NYCHA, which of course is an enormous topic, an enormously important one. New York City's housing authority, the largest public housing authority in America. It houses an enormous share of New Yorkers, and many of them are those with some of the lowest incomes in New York. So, I don't want us to get too far off topic, but tackling public housing, I think, is important for understanding the broader housing choices that are available to individuals. So the question itself asks, what could be an alternative to public housing through NYCHA? Can this be privatized? Of course, there is the RAD program, which you definitely encourage you to get into. But I think that there's kind of a broader question in there of not just how can we make NYCHA better, more sustainable, fix up the units that are there, but, asking the question, is public housing the only option that we have for those with the very lowest of incomes in New York? I wonder what your thoughts are, Eric.
Well, the public housing system we have, which has about 170,000 units and houses perhaps 400,000 people, is functionally the safety net for the very poor in New York. It's not the only way we house very poor people with public money. There are the rent vouchers that I alluded to earlier, which allow people to live in private housing, and they get assistance in terms of sort of topping up their ability to pay rent. There are also a few other smaller programs that built housing for very poor people over the years. But NYCHA is certainly the largest component. NYCHA's projects are certainly the largest component of the safety net. The issue with privatizing NYCHA, so to speak, is what is our objective? There is this private management program, which is called RAD, and NYCHA continues to own the buildings, and they contract with a private manager. In exchange, there's a federal program that makes rehabilitation funds available. And NYCHA's goal is to put about 62,000 of its 170,000 units into RAD. It's well short of that goal at the moment. There's a certain amount of political pushback, but the projects that they've been able to do have been successfully rehabilitated. The issue with selling off NYCHA is, of course, the safety net aspect. If you want to maintain the safety net aspect, then there won't be a purchaser. Without some continuing level of public commitment. If you give up, if you just decide that you no longer care about the safety net aspect, then there is, of course, the question of what happens to the 400,000 people who depend on this safety net at the moment. And certainly in the New York political context, that's not a subject of discussion at this point. I think there's
Jessica, I know you have
consensus on protecting those people.
Yeah.
Sure. So, the official count of NYCHA is that there's about 400,000 people living there. By any other measure, it seems that there's probably closer to 600,000 people. So it's a huge proportion of New Yorkers and a huge proportion of the lowest income New Yorkers. One thing that I think New York City has done well in public housing that you don't see in other places is that we do have public housing in much more integrated into neighborhoods across New York City than you see in other places, where it really is set aside in a way that has created really damaging impacts on neighborhoods. I think this idea of privatizing NYCHA, I think that word has been really kind of weaponized across the political spectrum. What NYCHA residents need is resources and transparency and accountability. So I think the RAD program does accomplish those. It's not privatization, but I'm reluctant to use that word on a program where the public continues to own the property, the public continues to pay for 90% of the property, the public, 10 new city agencies and government agencies come in to oversee it. So I think that's been an issue, but frankly, NYCHA residents have every reason to mistrust that process, and that's what you're seeing there. So we've been working through some recommendations for the city on how to preserve NYCHA in a way that residents can get on board with, where we're actually asking residents to sit in the driver's seat and make some really difficult decisions about who the development team is going to be and what their scope of work is going to look like for their programs. NYCHA residents have suffered enough. They frankly know a lot better than NYCHA what's going on with their buildings. So they have a huge wealth of information to bring to the table when talking to a development team about what's needed in the buildings. So we're hiring all these consultants all over the place for security and for the heating plant. And it's really been the NYCHA residents who have stuck it out and kept those buildings together. And I just don't see what reason the government agencies have to care if it's developer A or developer B on this particular property. I really feel like the NYCHA residents could bring a lot to this process and helping to select the development teams in particular. Hopefully that's something we'll be able to pilot later this year. And I think that over time, that will really prove the ability of that model to really to be in the best interest of NYCHA residents and the city as a whole.
All right, so Brad, looking forward, what is your hope? What are your encouragements to let's just say the mayoral candidates? If you're speaking to them, what's your message to them so that we don't slide further into an affordability crisis coming out of this pandemic, but go to a place where people feel like they do have affordable options and where they feel like they have a variety of all kind of housing types to choose from? What are your messages to them?
Yeah, I want to build on something Jessica mentioned earlier about the Soho rezoning. It's been really wonderful and inspiring to see the way the political winds have changed so quickly to a concept that would have been unthinkable only 3 years ago. The idea that we would be having a conversation about rezoning Soho, one of the wealthiest, whitest, nimbiest parts of New York City, for more affordable housing. And I think the great thing that the winds are moving in that direction. I think we need leaders with backbone and chutzpah who are going to push back on those who wish to wrap our city in saran wrap and are overly focused on preserving the physical character of neighborhoods, while more than happy to see the cultural character of those neighborhoods totally change. Change is universal in New York. It's been, one of the few kind of enduring truths of this city is it always changes. And if you, preserve entire neighborhoods in plastic wrap, the people in those neighborhoods are going to change. And if you don't allow new housing to get built, it's not going to get more diverse. It's not going to get more interesting. You're going to have what you see in Silicon Valley, where it's become a glorified retirement community. And I think that would be a shame for a neighborhood like Soho. So I would encourage any mayoral candidate to think hard about what they want the city to become and push back on vocal but ultimately small minority forces that are pushing back against that.
And Jessica, kind of a similar question to get back to you, and this is something that someone in the audience just raised. What's your day one as mayor housing action, and how would you love to see a new mayor then build in that day one action?
Sure. So I have a really, really wonky one. So hopefully there's some real regulations nerds out in the audience. So, you know, I'm a government person. I'm a bureaucrat, right? Maybe Eric can relate to this. So I believe in a government that creates rules about stuff. But I think we've gone so over the top, not just in construction, but in all aspects of the kind of work that we do. So renting up these buildings becomes an incredible challenge. So my kind of passion project for the new mayor is to take a look at the process around filling the apartments, around the documentation requirements for getting access to some of these public programs that we think are so great, but that frankly have this underpinning of, you know, who really deserves it. And if you need it bad enough, then you'll jump through all these hoops. And it's really, we're shooting ourselves in the foot, especially at a time where we hope that the Biden administration is going to come in with a ton of new resources, both on the construction and infrastructure side, and hopefully also on the social safety net side. And yet we've created this ocean of rules, and the amount of paperwork in order to move into one of these apartments is nothing that you or I could ever pull together on our own, right? But we expect a very poor, sometimes, and also homeless and schizophrenic person to come together with 6 months of bank statements and all this information. And it's really counterproductive to the goals. So a couple years ago, during one of the charter reform efforts, there was an anonymous comment, and I'm still out there looking for this person who sent in this anonymous comment, which is they wanted to reform the charter to say that for any new piece of legislation, you have to start by answering the question, what is this supposed to accomplish? How much is it going to cost? What would it mean to sunset? And how is this solving your problem as you define it? So it's a little shocking that we're not currently required to say we have this rule, and this is why we have this rule, because we have this goal behind it. But I think a lot of the kind of regulations that we're sort of swimming in all day we've kind of forgotten what the purpose behind it was, and we really need to take a second look.
If you're watching this and you are the person who came up with that question, please contact Jessica Katz, the executive director of the Citizen.
I can give you some credit. Until then, I'm keeping it.
Exactly. Eric, to you, you just published this mayoral playbook brief that Manhattan Institute published, so there's a quick plug. What would you say? You mentioned some already, like a missing middle housing, but what are some other good day of one actions for the next mayor that can kind of open up broader opportunities for reform down the line?
Well, I'll give Jessica gave, her favorite, and I'll give mine, which is that on day one, I think the mayor should ask the New York State legislature to raise the threshold for what's called a type 2 action for housing. Right now, 1, 2, and 3 family homes by state law are exempt from environmental review under the environmental conservation law. 4 units or more, you go into this process, and the process has just gotten more and more expensive and time-consuming to change zoning or do anything that requires a discretionary government action in New York State. I'd raise the threshold to 200 units. I can't imagine, the legislature wants to limit it to cities of 1 million or more. That's fine with me, but I can't imagine why you would want to subject another apartment building in New York City to environmental review, as if adding another apartment building is going to materially change anything of consequence in the environment of the densest city in the country. And, I think that, that's an example. That would save the city a great deal of money, and it would also save private applicants a great deal of money. And, if the mayor goes aggressively through all the rules, every hurdle that we have set up, each hurdle not being that terrible on its own, but in the totality of all the hurdles, it's quite daunting. The mayor really has to go through all the hurdles and say, is this necessary? What really in the vein of what Jessica said, what purpose was it intended to serve, and does it still serve that purpose at this point? And if not, let's get rid of it and let people build housing.
Great point to end. Also, I love good niche housing solutions. I love it. All right, Eric, Brad, Jessica, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. Thank you to everyone tuning in. Please stay tuned for tomorrow's conversation, 1 p.m. Eastern, on bridging the future infrastructure in the next mayor. It's going to be a terrific conversation. To follow the rest of our work, check out the New York City Reborn page and our mayoral playbook there. There should be some links on your screen. Thanks again for tuning in. All of this is possible thanks to you, our viewers, and the smart people here in this virtual room with us. So please stay tuned, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.